Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this evening's presentation by the Gibord Center of Take Heart Now, Spiritual Tools for Centering and Compassion. As you all know, we're doing this series because it's a terribly challenging time in the world today. And it's important for us to be able to hold on to our hearts right now and to our balance. Part of this series is trying to show diversity, trying to show all of the different ways that we find a way to hold on to being centered and being compassionate. And so when I was thinking about who our speaker would be tonight, I thought about my dear friend, Karen MacQueen, because Karen is not only an Episcopal priest, she's also a Nayaswami. And I have used her programs, her videos that she's done for the Gibord Center as part of the Christian, Hindu, and the Christian Buddhist dialogues, because that kind of diversity has been a way for us to deepen our own understanding of spirituality and centering. And as I was thinking about diversity, my friend Terry Opalak reminded me that June is coming out month. And it suddenly occurred to me that the Gibord Center had a chance to do something a little risky if Karen would cooperate. So I went to my good friend and said to her, I know that you are an intersex person. Most people have no idea what that means. And there is no group in the United States and around the world being targeted more right now than people with non-dominant sexualities, people who are non-binary. And I said, would you be willing, Karen, to share with us how you're staying centered and compassionate while you are one of this whole group of people that's being beat up, targeted, and help us learn, help us find our own compassion, help us learn how we meet folks like you and how we find a way to be curious instead of frightened. Gwen Gibord said that Karen MacQueen was both the smartest person she knew and one of the kindest. And it's true. And so, Karen, I welcome you as our speaker this evening, and I hope everyone will learn and open their hearts as they listen to you. My friend, Karen.
Dr. Lowe, thank you very much for your very generous introduction. I welcome everyone who is viewing this in person or who will view it subsequently in the archives of the Gibord Center. My name is Karen MacQueen. I also have a spiritual name, Nayaswami Karuna. And I occupy two unusual positions, or at least a position that's unusual for one person to occupy, and that is as an Episcopal priest, although retired, and as a Swami, a Nayaswami. Naya means new. A Nayaswami in the Nayaswami order founded by Swami Kriyananda, a direct disciple of Paramahansa Yogananda. I want to talk about the topic of transgender and intersex experience and the challenges that we face. Unfortunately, I'm uniquely qualified to talk about this. What is the problem with the gender binary? What is its problem? I would say two things. I've listed one, colonialism, and I will list the other, erasure. And we'll talk in a little bit of detail about what that's actually about. Let's get our terms a little bit so we're sharing common terms. Intersex refers to the diversity of biological variations in sex characteristics that deviate from the typical binary of male and female. That's me. I was born intersex with partial androgen insensitivity syndrome. Looking biologically more female than male, but not correctly either. It was given to my parents to make a decision as to how to raise me. They made the decision to raise me as a boy. My mother had lost her first child, a boy, 3 years before I was born. She was determined that I would kind of live out his life. She gave me his name, his toys, his photos, many stories about him, and constantly talked with me about how much I was like him. And I began to realize that I was destined to be a ghost child. I was destined to be somebody else, not even my own name. Transgender refers to describing the stable feeling. It's not coming and going. It's not fly by night. It's not, as some critics say, well, you get up one day and you think you're a woman, and you get up the next day and you think you're a man. This is a stable, perduring feeling of belonging to the opposite sex rather than the biological sex assigned at birth. Typically, in medical care for transgender people, we like to see this stable feeling having lasted between 6 and 12 years. The term cisgender refers to probably 99% of the people who are watching this, and it simply refers to the feeling of coherence between biological sex and perceived gender. So in this photo, you have a gentleman who probably very clearly sees himself as a male, and there's no dissonance there in how he sees himself. And a young woman who I think very clearly sees herself as a female, and there is no dissonance between her sense of herself and her perceived gender. That's cisgender. That is what the overwhelming majority of the population are. Intersex differences, here I'm just going to allude to the fact that there are many. There are more than 20 differences in sexual development that fall under the category of intersex. So what we're looking at here are 7 different categories of androgen insensitivity syndrome and how the person appears genitally as a result of where they are along the spectrum of that difference. I'm at a 6. I was born at a 6 on the spectrum of that difference. Transgender differences are really interesting because for the longest time we thought there were no physiological differences between transgender people and cisgender people. But like many things, as time goes along and science matures, we discovered that we were wrong. Intrauterine hormones drive the development of gender identity rather than social learning processes. Male physical appearance is formed in the first trimester. It's usually between the 7th and 8th week of the first trimester that a bath of androgen hormones begin to affect the fetus, and it develops the early primitive forms and gradually develops the mature forms of the appropriate gender markers and biological markers for the chromosome set. In this case, we'd be talking about XY and developing a penis, a scrotum, testes, and so forth. Or a female, an XX fetus, who develops something that looks like an overlarge clitoris and the beginnings of a scrotum trying to fuse together, and perhaps some streaks in her abdomen called gonadal streaks, which she will have to have removed by the time she's about 12 because they have a high incidence of developing cancer. What we're finding, though, with further research is that while the maturation of reproductive organs is more or less limited to the first trimester, brain development continues throughout the pregnancy. Hormonal influences after the first trimester do not change the biological sex. They determine it at the 7th to 8th week of fetal life. But the experience of gender might be responsible for the incoherence between biological sex and perceived gender. In other words, a continuous bathing of hormones antithetical to the development of this fetus may ultimately come to help explain the incoherence between the biological sex of that person and their perceived gender. These are early studies, they're meta-studies. They're by no means absolutely conclusive, but they're much better than anything we had even 5 years ago. Cisgender women and cisgender men in the structure of the brain differ in the structure of two major important structures, the putamen and the insula, that have to do with gender identity. And they differ in the whole brain analysis. This meta-study supports the hypothesis that brain structure in trans women, now get this for counterintuitive. Think of what you would think. Brain structure in trans women differs from the brain structure of their biological sex, male, as well as their perceived gender, female. This finding substantiates evidence that transgender individuals show specific brain structural alterations leading to a different pattern of brain structure than cisgender individuals. So transgender individuals may have a brain structure all their own. Let me talk about the issue of the gender binary and what's the big deal about it. For a lot of people, it's thought of as something ephemeral. You know, it's like my teenager got up yesterday to go to school, put on tattered jeans and some sneakers, put on an old shirt, and went out the door with a backpack whistling. And my same teenager got up this morning to go to school and put on some nice slacks, a nice pair of flats, a blouse, teased out their hair, and put on some light makeup. And my teenager's name is Simon. That is what a lot of us think this issue about the gender binary may be about, and that it may be inconsequential or ephemeral. But I want to suggest that it's far from that. I want to suggest that the gender binary, and this is based on a great deal of research done by sociologists, anthropologists, psychiatrists, psychologists, and lowly me, among indigenous peoples. And that is that the gender binary represents two things: colonialism and erasure. The gender binary represents colonialism to indigenous people because it is the front shield of the encroachment of Western, somewhat patriarchal, somewhat controlling culture and an intellectual framework for seeing the world and the people in it that seeks to absorb anything different. One only has to think of, for example, the laws in India after the British colonial empire took hold. All of a sudden, anything gender diverse was outlawed, the major crime. One of the innocuous things we find happening now is that there are swamis in India who will say, no, we can't reverse these because this is Hindu tradition. When in actual fact, if they looked at it, they might find this is the tradition of the British Raj, not Hindu tradition. In any event, one can see it as they wish, but there's no question that if you look around the world at the various places in which dominant cultures have come to take over indigenous cultures, colonialism is at the forefront, the attempt to dominate, determine the modes of thinking and feeling and categorizing people, and erasure, and the attempt to remove from the social world anyone who differs from that, whether it's a prison sentence or gathering up in some form of detention, deportation. In some cases, it has been mass murder. I'm going to look at a little bit at this under the umbrella of Indigenous people, because they're the most outspoken about the gender binary. And they have taught me the most about it. Because I have to say, myself, I didn't particularly like the idea of the gender binary and the fact that I would have to adhere to some rigid norm of what it meant to be a male or a female, for that matter. I'm my own person. I'm not always ladylike. I would like to be, but I am not always so. Let's look at some of these terms. Two-spirit people is a term that is used by indigenous North American cultures to describe individuals who embody both masculine and feminine qualities. It is a spiritual and gender identity that exists outside the binary understanding of male and female. Don't come to indigenous people of Turtle Island, that is North America, and bring them and lead with the words gender binary. You will not get a warm welcome. Let me ask you a question. Look at this photo. Did you ask yourself who's the man and who's the woman? And how could I tell? If you did, you understand in your own self the power of the enculturation of the gender binary, how profoundly and deeply it affects our thinking. Let's look at some types of Indigenous gender identity, because they're not far from us. Some of them are in our hemisphere or in the South Pacific. Mushe are found in Mexico, especially in the Yucatan and Oaxaca. They're a gender identity among the Zapotec people. Mushes are recognized as Mushes in childhood. Mushes recognize themselves as Mushes, and they recognize that they have a gender identity outside the gender binary. And they don't want to be talked about in terms of the gender binary. I once saw an interview program with two transgender social leaders interviewing a Mushe person from Oaxaca, and they couldn't stop talking about her as trans and finding programs for trans women in Oaxacan culture. And all the time she was saying, I am not trans. I am not gay. I am not bisexual. I am none of those things. I am Moshe. Mahu is commonly recognized in Trinidad and in Hawaii. They were traditionally respected caregivers and keepers of cultural knowledge. Mahu people embody a gender identity outside of the male and female gender binary. Mahu are recognized as traditional healers from the island of Trinidad, and they have brought their cultural practices and healing techniques to Hawaii. Fa'afafine hail from Samoa. They are typically assigned males at birth, but identify as seeing themselves outside the gender binary in childhood. They're typically highly prized among Samoan families because they take on an important role in Samoan culture, and that is to be the nanny for everybody's kids and the person who teaches the language and the culture to the children and enables them to pass it on. So having a fa'afafine in your family in Samoa is thought of as a real gift. And I just look at a couple of others and only want to mention the one at the bottom, Hinalei Moana Wonkalu, also known as Kumuhina. She is a native Hawaiian Mahu, a cultural practitioner, filmmaker, and activist. She has worked extensively to preserve Hawaiian traditions and advocate for gender diversity. She holds an important office in the Hawaiian education system and is got a role to play in all of the schools, making sure that traditional Hawaiian culture, including the culture of the Mahu, are passed on to Hawaiian children. What is one person's experience of being intersex and living under the constraints of being a transgender person in the face of our current crisis? Well, that's me. I'll tell you what my experience was like. I was born intersex. My mother lost her first child 3 years before my birth. She gave me his name. She gave me locks of his hair, photographs of him, many stories about him, and raised me to be him. I was in many ways a ghost child. And to say that it didn't fit would put it mildly. Didn't fit at all. How was I supposed to go to school and change in the locker room with the boys when I opened my underwear and saw nothing looking at all like male genitals in there? How was that supposed to work? I constantly had to have doctor's notes excusing me from PE. But even then, the boys weren't stupid. They would say, and they use she doesn't want to shower with us because there's something going on in there. It was incredibly difficult for me. I tell a story that most trans people can tell you. Because I was forcibly raised as a boy, I share in trans experience. That story is of being born and raised in a religious family and kneeling at the side of my bed at night and asking God, sometimes with tears, to please correct the mistake during the night and wake me up as a girl. I probably prayed that prayer hundreds of times. Of course, it never occurred to me at that time that God didn't think God had made a mistake. But I certainly thought that was possible. And I begged God to change me overnight. And the first thing I did was look under my sheets and see if there was any budding breast tissue. And there never was. There's so many experiences that are terribly difficult, being the object of bullying and being set aside by your peers because of who you are. I remember practicing walking during the Easter vacation. For the whole vacation, I practiced walking like a boy in my house, as we had a fairly long straight walk to the bus stop. And so I premiered myself on the first day back to school, walking along the way. And as I got closer, I heard, here she comes. She still walks like a girl. Let's talk now about what, in many ways, is among the most important issues. How do we keep ourselves from being torn apart by the crisis that we find ourselves in? Most people who are listening to this podcast are already involved in significant social justice work on behalf of immigrants, on behalf of trans people, on behalf of gay people, on behalf of women. And I have to tell you, as somebody who's spent a lifetime involved in those activities, it can ultimately become quite destructive. It can almost tear you apart because you eventually can come to resent and be angry at the people that you're opposing. And why shouldn't you be angry? They're wrong, right? Why shouldn't you be angry? Well, of course you shouldn't, because anger never creates anything good, ever. Moving into this sphere without leading with love and compassion accomplishes nothing. And in fact, does the opposite. It engenders anger and resentment in those we're disagreeing with. We need to be able to come into the fray, as frenetic and difficult and upsetting as it is. As much as our lives are on the line, we come into this with a lot of risk, all of us. We have to come in it the only way that will do any good and make any sense from a spiritual perspective. And that is to come with full hearts of love and compassion, hearts that are healing daily with and for us, so that we can bring our healing hearts to the tragic struggle that we find ourselves in. These approaches are the anchors for our lives when we're dealing with such difficulties. Some of you, nobly, are dedicating 10, 12 hours of your days to these struggles. And I have nothing but the utmost respect and gratitude for you. But I have a concern for all of us, and that is that we don't get broken hearts, that we don't get torn apart in this struggle, that we don't come to hate our opponents, that we stop coming to the fray with healing hearts full of genuine love and genuine compassion, not faked. I love this text from Yoganandaji, my Param Guru. The only true freedom lies in God, so strive deeply to contact him in meditation, morning and night. Yoga teaches that where God is, there is no fear, no sorrow. The successful yogi can stand unshaken midst the crash of the breaking worlds. That's what I'm looking for right now. I'm looking to be able to stand unshaken in what truly is in the midst of the crash of breaking worlds. And I want to tell you that this entire spiritual approach is all about being rooted in a genuine spiritual life. For many of us, our spiritual lives can be petitionary prayer about the work that we're doing, or for the people who are caught up in it and struggling and suffering. And I'm here to say that for your heart, that won't be enough. From the Chandogya Upanishad, there is a light that shines beyond all things on earth, beyond us all, the light within the heart. You need not search the heavens. That light is already glowing within you. You can't extinguish that light. You can't ignite that light. You just have to encounter it. Techniques to manage stress must be part of a lineage of authentic training. And I'm talking about a lineage that goes back decades, if not hundreds and thousands of years. Meditation is not for everyone. It is not an entirely beneficent thing. A certain portion of people who meditate experience increased levels of anxiety, increased levels of depression, and even the provocation of psychotic symptoms. Meditation is not for everyone. And if it's not for you, don't feel like you've made any kind of mistake or you're some sort of spiritual failure. You need to look for some form of movement meditation. And there I suggest Tai Chi Chuan and particularly Qigong as techniques that can help you meditate and focus moment to moment while you are doing the movements that are part of the technique of those practices. I'm going to refer very briefly to the lineage I practice in, the Kriya Yoga lineage. It is thousands of years old, strong influence from the various Santmat traditions, like Santmat Kriya Yoga focuses on hearing the primordial sound and on seeing the uncreated light. Encountering the light is the foundation of our spiritual life when we're functioning like this. Engaging in structured spiritual practices like this enables a devotee to regularly encounter the light, deepening the heart's openness and connection to the divine. How does Kriya Yoga work for me? You're free to look that over as you wish. You can see that it is a comprehensive program for me that involves me on all levels. Finally, I offer a form of the Jesus prayer as an adapted form of Tonglen from the Mahayana Buddhist tradition. And the instructions are right there. You need only substitute for the name Jesus, the name of the divine entity who expresses compassion and loving kindness to you. So it is simply breathing gently into your heart, imagining light and warmth, and imagining that that divine being, in my case, it would be Jesus, or it might be Sri Krishna, entering my heart. And then with a gentle out breath, imagining flowing out from my heart, the warm current of compassion and unconditional love that is being sent out to everyone around me without exception. And the prayer rope is a good way to count your way through this. This is a wonderful technique for clergy to use at the bedside of patients who are comatose. They can't talk to you, and you run out of things to say. But you can sit there and let this practice go on as long as you want. And then the social expressions of disciplined spiritual practice. And I suggest, because I'm a Gandhian, I suggest that we find new and more creative means to reinvent Sawadaya for our times. Many are doing it. Sacred resistance, in my view, is an attempt at doing that. And there are many others from the various lineages and traditions represented here today. We just need to work a little at kind of being creative and getting effective forms of Sarodaya on the ground that really help lift people up all at once. And then I've offered a practice, the Brahma Vihara from the Hindu tradition, or the Four Immeasurables from the Mahayana Buddhist tradition. You can read through them. I've included a book, The Wisdom of No Escape by Ane Pema Chodron, a Tibetan Buddhist nun who does a marvelous job of describing how to practice the Four Immeasurables. I've also encouraged the practice of self-compassion and your studying of the work of Kristen Neff and her associates. I've answered the question briefly, what is self-compassion? And I've reviewed the four pillars of self-compassion. I hope you found something of value in this for you, and I wish you nothing but good.
This is so rich, Karen. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. What's been the hardest part of this for you?
The feeling of not belonging and of ultimately never belonging. I had a period of time when I felt like I really belonged. However, given the current crisis that we're in, they're already advancing on my documents.
Yes.
I'm back to erasure.
Yeah. What is the most important thing we can do to reach out to somebody in your situation right now? And I think it's valuable for you to say a little bit more about what's happening to you, what the erasure means, because I don't think most people have any idea what someone like how vulnerable you are.
By the end of January, the Social Security Administration had already started listing all of my records in my 15-year-old name. And that is the name that I have to use with them in the future when I correspond with them. Doing it is erasure.
Yes.
It erases generations of my identity, generations of my growing naturally and spontaneously into the person that I am, who, for good or ill, I prize. And that erasure is going on for trans children, especially in the most extreme ways. The administration is cutting off medical care for them. You can only imagine the horror of a trans girl who's been maybe transitioning since she was 5 or 6. And now she's a pretty girl in dresses, and she's 12. And now she's told that the therapy that was going to help her to continue to grow as she was is no longer allowed. And she will have to go through male puberty. She will have to grow facial hair, male facial structures. She will have to get erections. She will have to go through all of the stuff that drop of her voice, all the stuff that goes with being a male. And now we're back at the suicide rates. The suicide rates among trans children and adolescents was 30 to 40%. We got it down to 2 to 5% with treatment.
Yes.
It's going right back up as we speak,
Yes.
as these children are being cut off from who they are and told they have to be someone else. I can't imagine the horror of it because I was intersex. I didn't have that much male hormone, so I never grew facial hair and all the rest. But I can't imagine what it would be like if I had to.
Mhm.
I can't even imagine. So that's pretty severe erasure when you take a little girl and turn her into a little boy.
And I think that's really important for us to know, because I don't think it occurs to most people that on birth certificates and on documents, doctors often put a name that is different than how the individual identifies. And what is happening now is that's what's being returned to. And so
Yes.
for the rest of us, that says, for all of us, it says that's a sensitivity that we need to carry. And we also need to really make room to be in our hearts to be able to hold and hear that anguish so that people aren't
And
going.
in our liturgical spaces, we may be able to offer ceremonies in which a person dons their real name. The Trevor Project is about to run out of funds, which is essentially its whole budget.
Mhm.
Is it possible for all these religious organizations to band together and supplement funding for the Trevor Project so that we're not leaving these children in the lurch? Is it possible to find a way to do that? That's putting our money where our mouth is. That's, try and sell it to your congregation. It might not be easy at all. I get that this is a journey, it's a process.
This is a time when we're all in this together and we can do only what each of us can do. And so we need that compassion for ourselves. And we also need to know how important it is when we're able to count on one another as we go through this.
I live in a deep state of fear and uncertainty, not knowing what comes next.
We have Judy Dickey asking, what do I say to MAGA clients? They're so afraid of trans.
Well, first of all, you may not be able to say anything to them. I think you have to accept that we're not omnipotent.
Yeah.
And it's an important thing to recognize when we're dealing with an issue like this. We're not called to throw ourselves against the wheel of history and get ground up in it. That's not an appropriate response. What I would suggest, though, other than that, is to begin to ask some questions. What does it mean to you? Simple questions like, do you know how many trans people there are in the United States? Because it's less than 1% of the population.
Yeah.
You'd think it was the Viking hordes coming over the ramparts to take us all captive. Less than 1% of the population. So try to ask little questions that might lead them to see that some of this is innocuous. It may not be successful.
Thank you, Karen.
You're welcome.
Part of our silence, perhaps, is taking it all in, right? And, while I had some expectation of what you would be presenting, to listen and listen what I hope deeply, and how I can go back and re-listen, is such an important part of what you're gifting us with. One thing I want to say, it's not a question, is please know that you're never alone.
Whether it's Muslim, Jewish, the variety of Christian denominations, Zoroastrian, Sikh, companionship, especially prayerful companionship, is a part of all of our traditions. It's just like when you need to go and look for a meditation tradition in your lineage, you will find it.
Mm-hmm.
You will find it there. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I think that this has been a very rich time and a very sober time for us. And one of the things that it's easy for us to forget that Mary reminded us of is that there is a lot of companionship. There are there were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of clergy downtown yesterday of every stripe and every form that came out to say we are with you in the struggle, to the immigrants there and the people there. And I think that today, one of the things that's very different is the number of people who are present to walk with our non-binary conforming folks. And there is great support, and you help us remember how important that is.
Thank you all so much for
Uh,
your attention, for your time. And my sincere desire is for your well-being and all of our well-being.
Amen. Amen. Thank you all. Thank you all for being with us this evening. And we look forward to seeing you at other Board Center events and hearing more from you as we go forward. Thank you all. Be safe. Be well. Good night.